A police officer's worst presumptions collide with an unexpected fact when a routine traffic check becomes a moment that defines his career. The man who controls his future is his aim. As the sun began to set over the streets of San Jose, amber and gold streaks painted the sky. After a long day at work, Derek Morgan was headed home. Eager to get rid of the tension of the day, he turned the air conditioning on in his SUV, which hummed pleasantly. The soft background music from the radio was a welcome diversion from the busy downtown streets. He slowed when he came to a yellow light that was about to turn red. At that moment, the red and blue lights behind him burst into flames, accompanied by the piercing sound of a police siren. Derek's brows furrowed slightly as he looked in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser parked behind him, and he rolled down his window and pulled over to the side of the road. Officer Terrence Walker, who was in his mid-40s and had a buzz cut and a shiny badge on his breast, came out. Walker, who was accustomed to being in charge, swaggered toward Derek's automobile, adjusting his belt. Walker said, "License and registration," in a bland but slightly authoritative accent. Without a word, Derek handed over his driver's license and reached inside his glove compartment for his registration. He moved calmly and deliberately, but he could sense Walker's eyes examining him closely, as though they were looking for an excuse to go further. Walking closer to the glass, Walker questioned, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Derek said calmly, "I'm not entirely sure," in a courteous but strong tone. Walker stated, "You didn't come to a full stop at the light," but his voice wavered slightly. Derek scowled but gave a small nod. "I see. I thought I slowed down in time, but I understand." Walker didn't answer right away. Instead, he lingered, studying Derek more intently, his eyes narrowing. For Walker, at least, it was no longer just a usual stop. He made a subtle but noticeable change in posture, as though he had already determined that this was more than a minor offense. The license in his hand caught the officer's attention. "You're not from around here, are you?" said he. After a brief pause, Derek answered, "I moved here a few months ago. My address is on the license." However, Walker wasn't paying any attention. The edge was beginning to creep into his inquiries, just enough to imply that he was no longer worried about a driving infraction. He seemed to be moved by Derek's coolness and leaned closer. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Derek answered, "Just going home," in a calm tone, although it was hard to miss the slight change in the atmosphere. Walker noticed more in Derek than just a driver. He saw something that made him suspicious. Derek didn't flinch, but he could feel the tension rising. Officer Walker had no idea that the composed demeanor was actually control rather than naivete. This was only the start. Walker stepped back and folded Derek's papers somewhat slowly, then slipped them into his chest pocket. He stood up straight, his face changing into a slightly arrogant one, as if he had already decided on the man seated in front of him. Walker said, "Get out of the car for me." Derek's face showed no expression, but his hands gripped on the steering wheel for a moment. With a controlled tone, he inquired, "Is there a specific reason for that, officer?" Walker's mouth quirked, but he immediately covered it up. The threat lingered in the air, unsaid but obvious. "I asked you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." With a long exhale, Derek opened the door. Walker's gaze swept over him as he emerged, assessing him. With broad shoulders and an unthreatening manner, Derek was somewhat taller than the officer. His polished shoes suggested someone who was attentive and meticulous, and his fitted suit suggested professionalism, but none of that seemed to matter. Walker pointed at the car's front end. Derek obeyed, moving calmly and deliberately. "Hands where I can see them." "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Officer Walker gave a small smile. "Just routine. We've had some incidents around here. You can never be too careful." Derek cocked his head slightly and met Walker's gaze. Walker's poise momentarily wavered as the question struck like a punch. "Incidents involving men in business suits driving sedans? Or does this have more to do with something else?" He stood up straight, his hand moving more reflexively than out of necessity toward his belt. He warned, "Watch your tone," as his voice became more stern. Derek said, "I'm just asking a question." His voice had a quiet firmness that seemed to unnerve the officer, but there was no defiance in it. Walker narrowed his eyes and leaned closer. You seem awfully familiar with how this works. You got something to hide? No, officer. I just believe in being clear about the reasons for an interaction like this. Transparency, you know, Derek said after a moment of silence. Walker snorted without responding. He took a step back and paced in front of the automobile in a tiny circle. He was unable to fully understand how the dynamic was changing. Derek wasn't acting like most people would. He wasn't flinching, he wasn't afraid, and he wasn't squirming nervously. Instead, Walker felt tense due to the elegance, control, and unnerving quiet. Walker whispered almost to himself, "You seem pretty confident, as if you know what's going to happen next." And Derek inclined his head slightly, but he didn't rise to the bait. "Respect is the problem here, officer. Confidence isn't." Walker paused for a half-second before turning back to him. There was no longer any smoke, only a harsher, almost protective substance in its stead. He opened his mouth to respond, but his words remained unsaid. He didn't like how Derek's poise was making him unsteady. The tension between them seemed electric as the stillness drew on, and Walker began to understand that this was not going to work out the way he had anticipated. However, he doubled down rather than backed off. The true test was just around the corner. Walker hardly disguised his frustration as he tapped his fingers against the holster on his belt. It was unusual for him to be challenged, particularly by someone with Derek's appearance. His eyes darted back to the automobile, as if seeking some excuse he hadn't yet conjured up. Walker said, "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," in a hurried manner. "I need to check for weapons." Derek's eyebrows went up. "Weapons?" he repeated in a tone that was measured but disbelieving. "Do I look like someone who's carrying a weapon?" Walker's jaw tensed and his poise briefly faltered. "I'm not going to ask you again." A flicker of something unreadable flickered across Derek's face as he hesitated. Then he turned and pressed his palms flat against his car's hood without saying anything. The crunch of Walker's boots on the asphalt broke the tense calm as he walked closer. The officer's hands lingered a bit longer than required as he gave Derek a fast, rough pat down. It was more than just a search. It was an effort to establish authority and elicit a response. Under the intrusive observation, however, Derek did not flinch, stiffen, or even shift. Walker whispered, "You're clean," and took a step back. His statement seemed hesitant, as if he was annoyed that he had not discovered any evidence to support his suspicion. Derek looked up at him, his eyes piercing, yet his face composed. "Of course I am," was all he said. "Now, officer, if you're done—" Walker interrupted, raising his voice a little. "I'm not done," he said. His need to maintain control was evident as the words came out too soon. "You seem to know a lot about what I can and can't do. Care to explain why?" Despite the intensity that was sizzling between them, Derek relaxed his posture by folding his arms. "I've had my fair share of interactions with law enforcement," he stated. "Let's just say I've learned a lot over the years." Walker's gaze grew strained. "So, you a lawyer or something?" Derek gave a small smile. "Or something." Walker seemed to become even more irritated by the uncertainty in his response. His voice fell to a near growl as he moved closer, encroaching on Derek's personal space. "Listen, you think you're smarter than me? Think you can talk your way out of this?" Derek looked him squarely in the eye without flinching. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Walker fell for it. "I don't think anything, officer. I just believe in fairness, and so far I'm not seeing much of it here." "Fairness? You think fairness is what this is about? People like you always—" he said, stopping himself suddenly, the words still partially escaping, but lingering like smoke. Although Derek's face remained unchanged, there was a slight but noticeable change in his stance, indicating that he had understood exactly what Walker had not said. "People like me?" Derek asked again in a quiet but profound voice. Walker reacted angrily, taking a step back as though he had just passed a boundary he was unable to reverse. He whispered, "You know what I mean," but his voice was not as firm as it had been a few seconds before. Softly, "I think I do," Derek said. His composure was no longer passive. Rather, it was razor-sharp, slicing like a blade through the facade. And I think we both know this interaction stopped being about a traffic violation a long time ago. Walker started to answer, but his words fell flat. He appeared unsure for the first time, as if he wasn't quite sure what to do. Power dynamics were changing, and Walker found himself in a precarious position for the first time. However, he would never forget the moment of reckoning that was yet to come. The heavy hush was broken by Derek's steady, unwavering voice. "Officer, I think it's time you know who I am." Walker's annoyance returned and his brows knitted. He retorted, "I don't care who you are," despite the slight crack in his voice indicating otherwise. Derek moved slowly and deliberately as he reached into his pocket. He calmly stated, "I'm reaching for my badge," as he observed Walker's hand flutter close to his holster. The words hung in the air, laden with an unspoken weight. "No need for theatrics, I want you to see it." As Derek produced a leather wallet and opened it to display a shining badge, Walker's gaze followed his hand. His voice was as informal as if he were introducing himself to a neighbor. "Derek Porter," he said, "Head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division." In an attempt to find evidence that this was a prank, Walker froze, looking at the badge and then back at Derek's face. Derek's look, however, was one of quiet authority and a faint trace of disappointment rather than humor. Walker repeated, his voice wavering a little. "Internal Affairs?" "Yes," Derek said before he could finish the thought, saving him the bother. "I oversee officer conduct. My job is to ensure that the people wearing this badge uphold the integrity and values it's meant to represent." Walker's self-assured manner unraveled in real time as his face went white. He retreated a little, his hands slipping from his belt as if the weight of his own power had suddenly become too much. Derek moved forward, filling the space Walker had involuntarily made. His voice was calm but sharp as he asked, "Do you know what the most troubling part of this interaction has been, Officer Walker?" Walker remained silent. He had the appearance of someone who had just realized he had stepped into quicksand and was clueless about how to get out. Derek went on, "It's not the profiling, but that's already awful enough. It's not the baseless escalation either. It's the fact that you've done all of this without even realizing who you were talking to. You assume that I wouldn't know my rights, that I wouldn't understand the laws you're sworn to uphold and why?" Walker parted his lips, but nothing came out. Derek stared at him relentlessly. In his words, "Because I didn't fit your idea of someone deserving respect," Derek concluded. His remarks had the force of an indictment, even if they were not furious. "And that's not just a problem for me, officer. That's a problem for everyone you encounter in this uniform." The full force of Derek's comments fell heavily on Walker, causing his shoulders to droop a little. He took another look down at the badge in Derek's hand, as though if he didn't look closely, it might suddenly vanish. Derek took a step back, allowing Walker to catch his breath, but his tone remained sharp. His words, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take a step back, return my documents, and think very carefully about what you say next." Walker's mouth opened, but he paused, obviously unsure of whether to obey or push back. He lost because he hesitated. "You're going to hear from me again," Derek continued, his voice a little lower. "Not as a driver you stopped on the side of the road, but as the man tasked with deciding whether you're fit to wear that badge." Walker took a deep breath, his face flushed as the gravity of the situation set in. His hands were shaking a little as he gave over Derek's license and registration, which he took out of his shirt pocket. Without saying anything, Derek accepted them and put them in his wallet. He took a step toward his car's driver's side door and stopped, holding the handle with one hand. He glanced over his shoulder and made one final attempt to look at Walker. "Remember this, Officer Walker," Derek addressed the group. "The badge doesn't make you better than anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." With his confidence damaged and his future uncertain, Walker stood in the last of the light as Derek climbed back into his car and turned on the engine. This was far from over for Derek, though. The entire department would be affected by his next move. Derek's mind was anything but quiet on the way home. He kept thinking about the experience, not because it was special, but because it wasn't. Derek knew that Walker would not be the last police he dealt with in this manner. However, things would be different this time. Derek was able to take action this time, The following morning, Derek sat at his desk in the Internal Affairs Division of the Sacramento Police Department, the early light pouring through the blinds. In front of him, an open file bore the name of Officer Bradley Walker. There were minor complaints of unprofessional behavior, unnecessary stops, and ambiguous misunderstandings that had never been adequately addressed. Thus, his record wasn't perfect. Derek pondered the wider ramifications while leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers. Walker was a sign of a more serious issue rather than an exception. Furthermore, Derek had no interest in dressing a wound from a bullet. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door of his office. Linda, his assistant, came in with a pile of reports. "Morning, Mr. Porter. I've got the summary on last month's misconduct cases. Also, Chief Malcolm wanted me to remind you about the department review next week." Derek took the paperwork from her and nodded. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also schedule a meeting with Chief Malcolm for this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with him." Sensing the weight in Derek's voice, Linda paused. She responded, "Of course," and then slipped from the room. Derek returned his focus to Walker's file, but he wasn't only looking at the officer. This was about the society that made it possible for someone like Walker to feel justified in his actions. It was about more than just one man and one encounter. And if Derek knew anything, it was that culture began at the top. Now, Derek was seated in a meeting room across from Chief Malcolm later that afternoon. As Derek described the traffic stop, Malcolm, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair, in a no-nonsense manner, leaned back in his chair and listened carefully. "I could have written it off as just another bad interaction," Derek stated with a firm but firm tone. "But that would have been a mistake. Walker's behavior isn't an isolated incident. It's a reflection of how much work we still have to do." Malcolm exhaled gently and scratched his temples. "This isn't the first time Walker's name has come up," he said, "but we've always handled it internally, quietly." "And that's the problem," Derek said in response. "Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening. It's time to be loud." Malcolm's face was marked by the weight of the discourse as he gazed at him. "What are you proposing?" Derek answered, "A department-wide review, without hesitation, not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" With his hands clasped on the table, Malcolm leaned forward. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." "Good," said Derek plainly. "It's about time someone did." The weeks that followed were jam-packed with reports, interviews, and meetings. Derek put in a lot of effort, gathering information, talking to police, and hosting open forums to get feedback from the local population. Change was sparked by the Walker event, which was a watershed moment that made the department face its shortcomings. Walker was subject to an internal hearing. Derek sat opposite from Walker during the hearings and watched as the officer writhed under the scrutiny, making no secret of his involvement. Although Walker was suspended as a consequence of the hearing, Derek understood that the true triumph was not in punishing Walker, but rather in stopping the next Walker. A few months later, Derek was speaking to a crowd of police officers, city officials, and locals from the platform of a community gathering. He talked about responsibility rather than blame, about our shared obligation to design a system that benefited everyone. His remarks were a pledge of change as much as a plea for accountability. Derek echoed his words. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys in the hallway. It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter. That's the badge I believe in, and that's the badge we're building here together." Despite the deafening acclaim, Derek didn't dwell on it. For him, this was the start of a greater story rather than its conclusion. Derek looked at the faces in the audience as he left the podium. Some were doubtful, some optimistic, but everyone was paying attention. He was aware that change would take time, but for the time being, that was sufficient. Tell this tale to someone who needs to hear it if it spoke to you. Let's begin the important discussions that will bring about change. For more stories like this one, stories that push us, motivate us, and remind us of what we can do when we stand up for what's right, subscribe to our channel.